Hello and welcome to Bud's RPG Review, where I give my thoughts on role-playing games, card games and board games. Today's review is Children of the Fall by Frenzy Kitty Games. Okay, first a bit of history. Billed as a GM-less story game for 3 to 5 players, Children of the Fall was originally funded in 2018 by an incredibly small Indiegogo campaign of just 32 backers. Despite this, it is available as a PDF and in print, standing at 150 pages. To the cover. Here we have a beautiful piece by Vincent Sammy that really captures the mood of what is contained within. Right, to the inside. Once we get past all the usual flavour text and credits, we get to Chapter 1, Introduction. Here it gives us an overview of the game. The players play the part of survivors of an apocalypse that has turned every adult on the planet into bloodthirsty savages known as the Fallen. It is a game of group collaboration where they will need to monitor the hierarchy of their tribe, build a haven for them to live in, and do what needs to be done to survive. Just under half of the book is taken up with the different play sheets needed to run the game, and also needed are 2 story tokens per player, an act track token, 3d6, pencils, paper and the like, and obviously players. The play sheets needed to run the game will probably be reused each session. After this we have the hook. The basics of the game world are thus. It is a game about children who are surviving in a world where all of the adults have gone psychopathically mad, bent on destroying all that is not an adult. When the child reaches the age of 16 to 18, this will become their inevitable fate. The players are the children of the fall, who are clinging desperately onto life amidst the madness. This is done through collaborative storytelling, and each player directs a scene in turn, and it has a simple system for adding twists and turns to the narrative. Each session, a mission is chosen from those available and sets a goal for the play, which should take between 2 to 4 hours. It makes a note on the tone of the setting, stressing the fact that it is intrinsically dark by nature and that the characters are children living in a hellish mockery of their former world, and as such some scenes may be understandably upsetting. It's probably not a game for everyone. After this it goes into GM-less story games. The idea behind the narrative is that it is collaborative storytelling and world building. Each player controls a single character and will take a turn directing the narrative, setting up scenes for the players to interact with. Non-active players are never out of the game, so to speak, as there are mechanisms built in to allow interaction. The idea behind this is a shared sense of player agency. Nobody feels like they're not being listened to, and nor are they railroaded. Another benefit is the idea that sharing the narrative keeps it fresh and unpredictable, as a player can take the story in an unknown direction and add plot twists. Additionally, the game does not need any preparation time, as everything is done on the fly. The author then goes on to stress that the term GM-less is a slight misnomer, as essentially all of the players are GMs. The players play the game to discover the narrative as the session unfolds, with each game approached with a blank slate. There are no win conditions, and all players are on the face of it playing toward a common goal and to tell an interesting story. It then goes into the inspiration behind the game. Perhaps predictably, things like Lord of the Flies and 28 Days Later are cited as influences, but also games such as Apocalypse World and Blades in the Dark, as well as the Fallout computer games. The author mentions that though the game works perfectly as a one-shot, it really comes to life at around 4 to 6 sessions, as the players can see the shifts in hierarchy and tensions simmering. People will die, but it will mean more if they are people that mean something to you. It gives some notes on how to run it as a one-shot, as well as a campaign, and then mentions that examples of players scattered throughout the book. Next up we have Chapter 2, The Fall. Here it goes into the state of the world. Over the course of a 48-hour period, the world changed. Everybody who wasn't a child changed and became bloodthirsty, violent maniacs with no trace of their humanity showing. They're known as the Fallen. They never speak or blink and grin ear to ear maniacally, destroying everything they come upon. They're described as evil and savagery incarnate and as monstrous, murderous cannibals. Only those aged 18 and younger are unaffected by whatever has changed the adults, and the surviving children have banded together to try to work out what is going on and to help each other survive. The Fallen themselves always change between 16 to 18 years old, and it is sudden and devastating. They transform into something savage and unthinking, with no scrap of remorse or empathy left. They're fiercely strong and have insatiable bloodlust and become incredibly tough and are hard to kill. Unless the highly unlikely event of a cure being found happens, falling victim to one of them, or eventually becoming one of them, is an inevitability. As explained, the players take the part of those children who've survived, usually between the ages of 12 to 18, who are banded together in a desperate struggle. It then goes into the cause of the fall. Frankly, nobody knows. There are many theories but no answers. All scientists and medical experts fell victim to what happened, so discovering the reason seems highly unlikely. Once someone has fallen, there's no coming back. There's no cure. Occasionally, a fallen has been captured and studied, but nothing of substance has been learned, due to there either being nothing to actually learn or the people studying it being underqualified. The fallen don't respond to anything, torture, pain, and even grievous injury. The only way to stop them is to destroy the brain, but guns and ammo are scarce. The fallen still procreate, though it's more primal and has more in common with mating through animalistic instinct. Pregnancy hardly slows the fallen, though for some not fully understood reason, when they give birth, they do not attack or consume the newborn infant. These other children of the fall are often found abandoned by tribes of children and rescued and raised. Occasionally, these newborns are used as bait by particularly savage fallen. Resources are scarce in this fallen world, and everything is slowly drying up and dying out. Communications are impossible. There is no electricity other than from generators, with fuel also being a dwindling resource. Clean water is also rare, and stockpiling is rife. Beyond this, the details are left down to the players and should emerge through play. Next, we have Chapter 3, Session 0. The aim of the Session 0 is for the players to collaboratively begin their world building before the game actually starts. It generally takes from 45 to 60 minutes and can easily be done as part of the first session. It is designed to be done in 4 phases: time since the fall, character creation, building a haven, and creating a tribe, and then this is followed by introducing the characters. First up is time since the fall. This is outlined as one of the most crucial phases to discuss, as it can stretch anywhere from day 1 to possibly a year and beyond the adults all lost their minds. This is to be predetermined by the group as to the starting point they want to take. 3 examples are given here of 6 days, 6 weeks and 6 months, all with variables as to how things stand. This is to be noted on the printable tribe sheet. After this is character creation. There are a number of playbooks found at the back of this book which describe different character archetypes, however only one can be chosen each game. No 2 players are to start with the same one. Players choose a secret for their characters, and we go more into character creation later on. Next is building the haven. This is the stronghold of the character's tribe, and they can be anywhere that the players decide, with each player fleshing it out along with the surrounding area. This is meant to be represented by a map that all the players contribute to, and this is also covered in more depth later on. Finally, we have defining the tribe. This is where the who, what and why are decided upon, including the size, short and long-term threats, supplies and leadership, and these are all noted on the tribe worksheet. Again, this is also covered in more depth later on. Once these 4 steps have been completed, it goes into character vignettes. Here, each one is introduced and then the game can begin. Okay, on to Chapter 4, How to Play. Each session roughly follows the following structure: select and customise a mission, take turns framing scenes over 4 acts, and updating the haven and tribe sheet. So firstly we have selecting a mission. The players essentially decide what they want to do in order to give the player framework. There are a load of missions in the back of the book for those feeling uninspired. After that we shift to acts and scenes. Each session has 4 acts, and in each act all of the players will take a turn at framing a scene. So the first act is the setup, the bulk of the narrative is in Act 2 and 3, and the narrative should wrap up in Act 4. It stresses the point that cliffhangers and unanswered questions can help keep things alive at the end of Act 4, and should be used if they are interesting. These acts are tracked on the mission sheet by moving the act marker once each player has had a turn framing a scene. Okay, so on your turn, you are the active player, and the others are reactive players. The first player to be the active one in the first session is the one with the oldest character, and after that it is determined randomly. You spend your turn framing a scene by describing what is happening and then play it out. The scene should progress the group story as well as the character's story if possible. When it is your turn to be the active player, you take your turn describing the scene and your character has to be present. Once you've set it up, play begins. You have complete control over the scene with the exception of the other player characters. The scene should last around 5 minutes and is ended at any point by the active player or by group consensus. Once each player has had a turn, the act is complete. Being very descriptive is encouraged, and due to the limited number of scenes, you need to make them count. The story should always be driven forward, with the focus being on what is interesting and important. The active player should encourage feedback, as this is obviously the nature of collaborative storytelling. We then have 2 pages of an example of play, and then it moves on to story points. Each player starts the game with 2 story point tokens. They are used by the player to add a complication into other players' scenes in order to make things dramatic. When you add a complication to another player's scene, you give them one of your story points. This has the effect of giving them more agency in subsequent scenes due to them having more story points. Dice are only rolled in game when resolving a complication. You roll 2d6 and add them together to get a total. Complications are defined as plot twists and dramatic moments and are the main mechanic of Children of the Fall. These can be added by reactive players to active players. To do this, you give the token, represented by using whatever you have at hand, to the player and describe to that player what the complication will be. Obviously, the more interesting and dramatic, the better. Once the complication is understood, the active player rolls 2d6. On an 8+, they avoid the complication, describing how they avoid it and keep the story point. On a 7 and below, their complication happens. They carry on with their scene but include the complication in their narrative. They also mark a trauma point on their character sheet. The next section covers trauma points and downfalls. Downfalls are described as story prompts that are included in the narrative based on your success at dealing with complications. Each player has 3 downfalls, which vary between characters, and each is a narrative prompt for a negative event that can happen to your character throughout the game, and are often thematically linked. The third and final downfall is usually death or worse for the character, and they are triggered by failing 3 complications. When you fail 3, you gain a trauma point. When you have 3 trauma points, you choose one of your character's downfalls to weave into the story. If a downfall is marked during Act 1 or 2, you need to incorporate it into the character story by the end of that session, with the upside being that you can't be the target of any more complications until that downfall is resolved. In addition, each character has a determination point per session that do not accumulate. When rolling to overcome a complication, you can spend your determination point to get an extra d6, so you then roll 3 and drop the lowest, giving you a slightly better chance of avoiding the complication. Also, each player has a helix point. These can be spent at any time during the session to change the result of any die roll. These can be spent to affect other players' rolls too, and can be used to help or hinder. They cannot be stacked to cancel each other out. After this, we move to the timeline. It does suggest that the events can be fast-forwarded for more mundane scenes, like eating dinner for example, and that flashbacks can be used to create drama and tension. Each player can only frame 1 flashback, and more than 1 per game is unusual. It also makes the point that knowing when to start a scene and when to end it is important. On the death of characters, it does stress that the world in the state that it is in is bound to cause people to die, making the point that there are no hit points or damage tracking, and that the player ultimately decides if their character dies or not, and that this does not mean you are necessarily out of the game. If your character dies in Act 1 or 2, you can introduce a new character to join the game from that point. If they die in Act 3 or 4, then you can still frame a scene, though these are always flashbacks or ones where your character was not present, this being the only instance where you can do that. In addition, you can choose an NPC and use them in that scene. Next, it touches briefly on managing the spotlight, saying that the aim is to give each character fairly equal time, and that this is usually something all the players should work towards. Also, it talks about updating the Haven and Tribe sheet, pointing out that there are many times when elements of either will change in-game, and that these should be usually updated at the end of the game, though sometimes the narrative will lean more towards doing it in-game. Next, we have Chapter 5, Characters. This is broken down into 6 phases. Choose character playbook, complete character description, character questions, character remnants, define relationships, and character secrets. First up is choosing a character playbook. There are a bunch of these in the back of this book that can be printed or photocopied, and they give a number of character archetypes. As previously mentioned, there is only 1 of each archetype in a party, and players should think about what they want to get out of the character. We then have a list of 13 pre-created ones, such as the Troublemaker, the Diplomat, the Innocent, and even the Prophet, which has a tone warning as they can be dark and manipulative. After this, we go into the character description. Obviously, the players need to come up with the usual things like quirks, facts, and the bane of all gamers, a name, but there are also a few game-centric twists. Each character starts with a remnant. This is something that they have kept since before the fall, though it serves nothing but a narrative purpose. On the attached playbooks, each character has a few questions that the player needs to answer, things like what is your greatest fear, what have you lost, and the like. This is followed by introductions, where the players talk about their character to the others, and then there is defining relationships. This is where you define the relationship you have with the other characters. In addition, each character has a secret. This should be something that could have an impact on the narrative. Following this, we have Chapter 6, The Haven. The Haven is the safe place where your tribe lives. It's a stronghold and base of operations. In Session 0, this is where the group decides what the Haven is and what some of the surrounding elements are. The location is important in that it impacts the narrative of the game. If it is somewhere isolated, then finding supplies could be harder, but less isolated means a potentially larger chance of threats from other tribes. They are usually in an existing structure modified to be more suitable, and possibly a stronghold in itself if it is a long time since the fall. It gives us a few suggestions, things like a prison, a lighthouse and a mall. Once a place has been agreed upon, a blank sheet of paper is placed on the table, and in the middle a drawing of the haven is done, as so. All of the players then take turns to draw a single element onto the map. This should be creative and provide inspiration for the narrative of the game. The map is meant to be interactive, and as the game grows, so should the map. After this, we move to projects. This is when new objects are added or removed from the map and should be drawn on. This helps to serve as a visual history of the tribe and haven across a campaign. Next is Chapter 7, the tribe. There is a principal playbook included and shown here. You have the option to name your tribe or leave it blank. You should then decide on the tribe size. Larger tribes are often harder to manage but stronger, whereas small tribes tend to be more loose and a bit more freeform. The rough numbers are up to 8 for small, 9 to 15 for medium, and 16 plus being large. On the sheet you write down something you need and something you have a surplus of, with the example of here being a shortage of fresh water and a surplus of food and vegetables. Next you note down the threats. There are two aspects to this, short and long term. The examples given here are an immediate threat being an incoming hurricane and the long term being low medical supplies. It then shifts focus to the tribe development. Depending on when the tribe was formed, i.e. near the beginning of the fall or months in, should determine how organised they are and should have the biggest impact on whatever tribal concept you decide upon. You then determine the tribal hierarchy on the sheet to make sure of who the leader of the tribe is, as well as a second in command, and additionally you add someone who is desperate to be in charge. Anyone using the leader playbook will always take the tribal leader role. Leaders and the rest of the hierarchy can emerge naturally during play. It makes the point that power is the most valuable commodity after the fall. We then move on to Chapter 8, Missions. Before play begins, a mission needs to be selected by the group. These act as a structure for the narrative of the session, designed to get the creative juices flowing, but are vague enough to encourage creativity. There are 8 included here, and they act as a kick-off point for the session. Once you've decided on a mission, you should answer the questions in the mission playbook. The missions are obstacles that they need to overcome, and it mentions that simple missions are boring and that boring is bad. It makes the point that on the mission playbook there is an act track. This is somewhere to track which act follows which in the current session you're in. It also gives some basics on creating your own mission. The rest of the book is filled with playbooks that can be photocopied and a page of designer notes. Children of the Fall is a game with a great premise. The inevitability of the children of the setting suffering the same fate as the existing adults gives a sense of the sword of Damocles waiting to fall. It's not a matter of if, but when. The idea of a collaborative story-driven game with incredibly minimal mechanics is not really groundbreaking, but there is just enough here to get by with to be able to tell your story within the constraints of the world, and I think it could prove an ideal way to introduce someone to role-playing in general. Though perhaps not children, as a world where every single adult is a bloodthirsty cannibal, literally out to eat you may not have the desired effect. The book itself is nicely done, with plenty of white space and a nice flow to the writing for the most part. However, there are a few issues. Firstly, it could have done with an editorial pass, as there are moments of repetition, some spelling mistakes, and occasionally the flow of the writing stalling. For example, character creation starting on page 28, but then saying go to page 52 to actually do it. And the inclusion of all of the playbooks as being photocopied is perhaps a step backward, as maybe just providing a link to DriveThruRPG to get them as a free download would perhaps have been a better option, and the book would have been half as thick. It feels like a bit of a waste. Another thing is the likes of remnants and secrets. They could be easily included without even having them labelled, but putting them in without tying a game mechanic to them that could add a twist to a scene seems kinda pointless. It's worth mentioning that the art is for the most part really good throughout, and it fits the setting nicely, though I do feel that the book is a bit too expensive at $20 when you consider that half of it is resources. My overriding thought when reading this was not to play it as written, but to hack it with Tales from the Loop and have it as a GM game, as I think having a system that works fine and already caters for children, tweaked to include the likes of Downfalls and all things Children of the Fall, could produce some memorable experiences. The main issue I have is that if I saw this game in a listing for a convention, I would be excited about playing it until I saw that it was a GM-less, collaborative storytelling experience, at which point I'd probably skip to the next game. Not because it's bad in any sense, because it isn't, but because that kind of game just doesn't especially grab me. But if this kind of game is your thing, I think you could have a blast. I'd give Children of the Fall a 6.5 out of 10. If you enjoyed this review, please make sure to hit the thumbs up, subscribe to my channel and check out my other videos. Also, if you're interested in buying this product, I'll put some links below. Lastly, if you like what I produce here, then maybe think about supporting me on Patreon or even becoming a member of my YouTube channel. Bud out.